and I'd never heard of the Cornish Owlman. I have no doubt that this is not something that can be explained. Okay, my name's John Downs. I'm the director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology in the UK. I've been doing this professionally 32 years, and it's been something that has interested me since I was 8 years old, and I'm now 64.
Yes.
It is. I mean, I was brought up in Hong Kong, which was still a British colony. And every Thursday, my mother would go into town. She'd go and play tennis with her friends and then have coffee afterwards. Then she'd go to the library and she'd bring back thrillers for my father to read, picture books for my little brother, and books about animals for me. And one day she brought back a book called Mythful Monster, which turned me on to the idea that there were people who believed in Bigfoot and the Yeti and the Loch Ness Monster and Mystery Big Cats and all these other things, which I'd never heard of. And it just totally blew me away. And the next day I went into school and I remember the teacher did this thing saying, so what are you going to do when you grow up, children? Billy, what are you going to do when you grow up? I'm going to be a train driver, miss. Freddie, what are you going to do when you grow up? I'm going to be in the army, like my dad, miss. And Jonathan, what are you going to be when you grow up? I'm going to be a cryptozoologist, miss. And she had no idea what I was talking about and thought I was being stupid. So that was the beginning of my journey into cryptozoology.
So where has that taken you in your years of study and looking at all of these potential cryptids in the world? What have been some of the more interesting stories that you have encountered?
I've been to Puerto Rico twice looking for the Chupacabra, and that's one of the highlights of my professional career because, as anybody who's read my book, Island of Paradise, will know that I've come as close as I think anybody is going to come to an explanation for the Chupacabra, which makes sense, but doesn't go into science fiction. It's been one of the things that I've realized throughout my professional career is that things that appear to be weird and appear to be scary and like something out of a horror comic quite often aren't. And there's quite often rational explanations for things. It's just a matter of looking in the right place for the answers.
So what did you find in Puerto Rico that was so fascinating?
Okay, first of all, I found that there hadn't been any chupacabra related killings when the creatures had been completely exsanguinated since the end of the last century. I actually carried out a necropsy on a chicken that had been attacked by a chupacabra, which was one of the last animals to actually be attacked in a vampiric manner and exsanguinated. And when I cut it up, I found that not only was the body completely drained of blood, but the liver, which is the most highly vasculated organ in the animal's body, had disappeared. And there was a puncture mark in the side of the chest, and there were two little puncture marks in the neck. But there was the diaphragm, which separates off the chest cavity from the stomach cavity, was unbroken, which doesn't really seem to make much sense at all. But on my second visit to Puerto Rico probably 20 years ago, I went to several plantations up in the hills where people had claimed to have seen the chupacabra. They seemed to claim to have seen a upright walking creature with spikes up its back. And this at first makes no sense at all. But when I was talking to the farmer, and he had a farm growing different types of plantain trees, bananas and all sorts of other plantains. And if any of you have ever seen a banana tree, unlike ordinary trees, it doesn't have a wooden trunk. It's layers upon layers upon layers of leaves that grow together into a trunk-like structure. And when I was a boy in Hong Kong, on several occasions, I'd seen banana trees that had been attacked by porcupines. And you can see the way that the porcupine, it's a bit like sort of playing pass the parcel when you're a child, unwraps the banana, unwraps the green fibrous leaves and fibrous tissue around the side of the trunk in order to cut it down. A bit like a beaver cuts down trees in the forest, except it unwraps it rather than cuts it down. And much to my absolute amazement, when I asked the farmer, I said, "Well, Senor, can you tell me what other strange things have happened?" He said, "Well, something's been attacking my banana trees." And he took me up to the far side of his plantation, and I saw two banana trees that had been peeled down in exactly the same way as the porcupines had attacked banana trees when I was a child. But there's a big problem with that. Officially, there ain't no porcupines in Puerto Rico. There was once, there's an animal known from one fossil, and the fossil was destroyed in the war, a fossil porcupine, but the difference between Old World porcupines and New World porcupines is that New World porcupines are at least arboreal. They live in trees, and they don't have such big pointy spines as Old World porcupines. But what I have hypothesized is that back during the dark days of the Atlantic slave trade, Puerto Rico was one of the first places where the slave ships would disembark. And porcupines are very hardy, and I have wondered often whether the slave traders brought porcupines along on their ships with them as food, that because they are very hardy, they wouldn't die under difficult circumstances. They just stay there alive with fresh meat ready until the people on the ship could slaughter and eat them. And I have wondered whether there is a possibility that some of these African porcupines, which were brought over for bushmeat, were actually then let go or escaped onto Puerto Rico, and they're still there now because porcupines, especially the Old World porcupines, will walk semi-upright. They got spines coming down their backs, and they eat banana trees in the same way as these two that I saw on this plantation up on the Canaveras Plateau. So that is my theory about that's half my theory about what the Chupacabra is, but that doesn't explain the attacks upon wildlife and domestic animals, which have been reported as being completely exsanguinated, and like the one I saw, like the chicken that I did the necropsy on, that they do have sort of signature wounds on their neck. Now, I was talking again on the same farm to this farmer, and I said, "Well, what else has happened?" He said, "Well, say, no, this is very strange, but I had my peacocks attacked." And he apparently had a little flock of peacocks that used to roam around his farm, and a whole bunch of them had been attacked. And he said, "This is very strange. It have a triangular hole at the top of its skull." And again, from my childhood in Hong Kong, I know that triangular holes in the skull and two puncture marks in the neck are diagnostic of what happens when a mongoose attacks small domestic wildlife like chickens or ducks or rabbits. And again, there ain't supposed to be mongooses in Puerto Rico. Mongooses are completely an old world animal. But I discovered that in 1892, I think, late 19th century anyway, mongooses were introduced to Puerto Rico to keep down the rat population. And later in my second trip, I actually saw one. So there were still mongooses there. So I believe that the vampiric attacks on livestock are actually on mongooses, and the thing that walks upright with spikes down its back is actually an old world porcupine. And one of these days, I intend to go back to the high grassland plateau above Canóvanas and get permission from the landowners to put up nets all the way around the side and then try to smoke out whatever's in there. And I would be very surprised if we don't catch a porcupine of some species. But I think that's one of the things I've done that I'm most proud of.
Well, Chupacabra is also known in other areas besides Puerto Rico. Have you gone anywhere else or studied them in other areas besides that vicinity?
I have, but the word Chupacabra in the last 20 years, 30 years, has become synonymous with monster. And all sorts of creatures across Latin America and the southern states of the USA are called Chupacabra, whereas they have very little in common with the accounts of the semi-bipedal creature with spikes down its neck. For example, and I was involved with this as well, back in 1990, no, in 2003 or 4, 2003, I think, a farmer called Devon McAnally in a place just fairly near San Antonio shot what he thought he'd seen, this blue-colored dog-shaped creature with no hair, and he thought that it was attacking his wildlife, so he shot it. And he took a photograph of it to the local shop, which is it was and still is, as far as I know, because I went there last 10 years ago, owned by a Hispanic lady who laughed and said, "Hey, it looks like you have your very own Chupacabra." And somehow that got into the newspapers, and these blue-colored dogs, and they're something different. Some people say they are coyotes with mange. Other people say they are something totally different. I've examined bodies of a couple of them, and the jury's still out as far as I'm concerned. But just because this lady made a joke about, "Hey, you've got your very own Chupacabra," it got in all the newspapers that the Chupacabra is now attacking domestic animals outside San Antonio, and the story spread all the way across the United States, parts of Mexico, and all sorts of other places. So the word Chupacabra really nowadays means bogeyman or monster. It doesn't necessarily refer to the creatures from the high grassland plateaus outside Canopus.
Well, they certainly are interesting characters. I've seen some etchings of what people have seen, and they do have kind of an unusual look, but you feel like they're more akin to this porcupine-like creature from that was brought onto the island.
That's what I believe, because that makes sense. I mean, all the different parts of the story will match up with that. Whereas all the other explanations that have been given, I mean, you have to suspend rational belief for a while. The idea that they're genetically modified creatures from government research laboratories, or that they are aliens, or that they are subterranean living humanoids covered in spikes that would have lived there since before mankind existed. All these stories, they're all jolly good stories, but they're all science fiction. Whereas my theory about them being porcupines is still very interesting, but that, I believe, is far more cogent than any of the science fiction sort of explanations.
Yes. What other cryptids have you researched or do you have knowledge of?
Oh golly. I'm probably best known. Excuse me, I've got a cat trying up and eat my breakfast. Let us go away. Sorry, you can probably edit that out, me having a frank exchange of views with my cat. Let us get down. I'm probably best known for a book that I wrote first about 25 years ago on the Cornish Owlman, which is sort of it's a Cornish equivalent of the Mothman from Point Pleasant in West Virginia and from Chicago, the most recent sightings. I'm very interested in these flying humanoid sightings which take place across the world. I've also done research into lake monsters in Scotland and across the Northern Hemisphere.
Well,
And
tell me about this. Tell me about the flying humanoid. What have you learned about that, and what is your interest in that?
my first wife gave me back in 1989, I think, gave me a book for my birthday called Mr. Animals of Britain and Ireland. And I'd never heard of the Cornish Owlman, but I became totally fascinated with it. And I then spent the next 10 years or so trying to track down as many eyewitnesses and as many people involved in the story as possible. And I have no doubt that this is not something that can be explained in zoological terms of reference. I'm pretty sure that you can explain the lake monsters in zoological terms. I'm pretty sure you can explain Chupacabra in zoological terms. And at least in North America, I'm pretty sure you can explain Bigfoot in zoological terms. But the Owlman is something, I don't like to use the word paranormal because I think these things, there's nothing paranormal about them. I think they are perfectly normal. They're not supernatural, they're not paranormal. They're perfectly natural, they're perfectly normal, but they're defined by laws of physics that we just don't understand at the moment. And something I did discover was that, with one exception, all the witnesses to the Owlman in Cornwall, anyway, were young women and girls. And I then I'm sure you've heard the claims that poltergeists are usually found in conjunction with emotionally disturbed young women, quite often going through puberty. And I think that this is the same sort of thing. I think it's sort of like a three-dimensional poltergeist that, for various reasons, that there are a lot of folkloric and semi-mythical links in that part of the country to giant predatory birds. And I think somehow this is like a three-dimensional poltergeist, which somehow manages to tap into the zeitgeist of the area, which has got all these accounts of giant, scary bird monsters. For example, that was the part of Cornwall where the tin miners from Phoenicia, which is now Lebanon and Syria, came to buy tin from the Cornish tin miners back before Christ was born. And in fact, it's actually claimed that Christ's uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, was actually a tin trader, and that on one of his journeys to Britain to buy tin, he brought the young Jesus with him. But the Phoenicians had a particularly nasty religion in which they worshipped a giant owl, and they did human sacrifices, especially of children, to this giant owl. And I think that the fact that you've got little girls seeing an owlman in Cornwall now, in a place where little girls had been sacrificed to a giant owl from Syria 2,000 years before, it's too big a coincidence for there not to be a connection.
I don't think I've ever heard the term 3D poltergeist, but I find that really fascinating. Do you think the cryptid world as a whole might possibly be that?
No, I think there are all sorts of creatures which get all sorts of things that get labeled as cryptid. Some of them, not my dog, I know perfectly well he exists. Some of them are animals that we haven't discovered. Perfectly normal flesh and excuse me. Archie, be quiet. Sorry, my animal's behaving badly this morning. Perfectly ordinary animals that just haven't been discovered yet. The second lot are animals that we know what they are, but they're in the wrong place or at the wrong time. And the third one are what I've called zooform phenomena, which are the ones that take us into X-Files territory, which includes three-dimensional poltergeists. That's, by the way, my term for them. But
what do you know about Bigfoot?
I'm very interested in Bigfoot. I'm one of the people who doesn't believe the Patterson video. I know that lots of people, including friends of mine, including people I have great respect for, think that the Patterson video is real. I still think it's a man in a monkey suit. But when I was in Texas in again 20 years ago now, pretty well. I was November 2003. I was in Orange County, which is fairly near Netherlands, near Houston. And I was visiting a researcher that I'd never met, but we'd spoken by email many times, a guy called Chester Moore Jr. And he gave me a footprint of a Yeti, of a Bigfoot. He gave me a footprint. And he showed me he had, I think, something like 40 of these footprints, all that had been cast from a a long line of these prints out in the swamps. And whereas I'd seen individual footprint casts before, to see 40 of them in a long line and to see that they were obviously from the same feet and that they were so detailed you could even see the dermal ridges, the equivalent of fingerprints, on the soles of the feet. That blew me away, and I'm a firm believer now.
Firm believer that these casts were real?
That these casts were real, and that there is there in various parts of North America, I believe there is an unknown higher primate, whether it's a primitive person or whether it's an unknown ape. I don't know. There's evidence to suggest there's evidence to suggest both hypotheses, but there are some unknown primates in North America and across what used to be Soviet Central Asia. We've sent expeditions to Kabardino-Balkaria in southern Russia looking for evidence to support the theory that there's a hairy humanoid called the Almasty, which is probably a very primitive human being that lives in a band all the way across Central Asia, from southern Russia at one end to Mongolia at the other end. And we've sent 2 expeditions to Tajikistan looking for what appears to be an even more primitive hominin of some description called the ghoul. So yes, I'm convinced in Asia and parts of North America these things exist. It gets more problematical when you're talking about these things existing in Australia, New Zealand, or Western Europe, because whereas there is no logical reason why these things shouldn't exist in Central Asia, North America, there's plenty of room for them to live, there's plenty of food for them to eat. When it comes to Western Europe and Australia, it's a different thing, because Britain is one of the most crowded countries in the world, but it does have persistent, and we're working on a series of these at the moment, persistent sightings of what people claim to be a Bigfoot-like creature. And in Australia, it's even weirder, because in Australia, there was up until, I can't remember, about 7 million years ago, I think, there was a land bridge which connected Australia with mainland Asia. But that land bridge was washed away by the sea before placental mammals could make it as far as Australia, which is why apart from rats, mice and bats, the only mammals in Australia are marsupials, the pouched mammals, and monotremes, the egg-laying mammals, which are both very, very primitive. And if the sightings of what are called the Yowie in Australia are a real living flesh and blood carbon-based animal, they are not going to be either monotremes or marsupials. They are going to be placental mammals. And it is very hard to see how placental mammals could have crossed the Tasman Strait from Indonesia to Northern Australia without boats. And although some people have claimed that the Yowies made boats themselves, I think that's highly unlikely. And New Zealand's even weirder, because New Zealand was never connected to the mainland landmass, not since pre-dinosaur times. But there are still, especially on the Coromandel Peninsula, there are reports of there being Bigfoot type creatures there. So I think that they're a mixture of, some of them are unknown animals, some of them are folkloric creatures that people have externalized, and some of them are the things that like I already said, I don't like using the word paranormal or supernatural, but something that fall into my zooform phenomena category.
Think of the Sierra sounds. Have you heard the Sierra sounds and the potential language that might be within that vocal?
Yes, I have. It's very, very strange and very, very interesting. It's not something I know much about, but I have heard them, yes.
Do you think there's a potential that they actually have a language or are speaking something that is more human-like?
I think it's probable that they have some form of communication, whether it's as structured as a language as human languages, I don't know. I mean, a lot more work needs to be done on that.
So over the years of all of your research, you obviously have a wealth of research of many different cryptid characters. But what are a few others that you think are interesting?
We've sent, I think it's 7. So, now this is the end where I'm going to stop Archie being noisy and stupid. He's going to have to come and sit in my lap and be good. We've done 7, I think it is now, expeditions to Indonesia looking for a creature known as the orang pendek on the island of Sumatra. And we've heard it, we've got footprints from it, we've had a hair sample from that, which was analysed by a scientist at Copenhagen University, who said that it was similar to, but distinct from, an orangutan. And we, on 2 occasions, in fact, members of the expedition had actually seen one. I think there's no doubt that they exist, and we believe that they're probably the 4th species of orangutan, because up until about 15, 20 years ago, it was thought there was only 1 species of orangutan. Then it was decided that the Bornean orangutan and the Sumatran orangutan were 2 totally different and distinct species. Then, within the last 10 years, a 3rd species, the Tapanuli orangutan, was discovered in Sumatra. And so we can see that from a basal zoological form, this is one of those species which can throw off new species quite easily. So the idea of there being a 4th species of orangutan, which even more than the Bornean orangutan actually walks on the ground, lives on the ground more than it does in trees, again, makes a lot of sense. Whether, as some people have claimed, it can be linked into the stories of the little men, such as the ones that the fossils were found on the island of Flores in Indonesia about 15 years ago, and have now been named Homo floresiensis, whether they've got anything to do with the orang pendek mythos or not remains to be seen. I think that if there are any surviving Homo floresiensis, one of their close relatives, they are going to be the animals behind another semi-mythical Indonesian animal called orang kardil, or the little men of the forest. And I think that they are, if they exist, and do you remember a few years ago there was some footage on YouTube of a little naked man carrying a spear running along a path in the middle of a bamboo plantation. being chased by some kids on trail bikes. That, I think, is very, very, very likely to be something similar, if not the same, as the Homo floresiensis. But all the humanoid animals in Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the rest of Indonesia, I find fascinating. Another creature which I'm almost certain exists is the thylacine, the Tasmanian wolf. The last known specimen died in 1936, but there have been thousands of sightings ever since. And even mainstream scientists and I think that they certainly existed up until the beginning of this century, if not to this present day. So that's something I'm certain exists. And a lot of the things which interest me are the more obscure things. I've done lots of work on an animal called the beech marten, which is found all across Europe, but until the 1860s, it was thought that they lived in Britain, and then it was decided that they didn't. But there's quite a lot of evidence that they still do, and that is something I've been studying now for well over 30 years. But there's all sorts of things.
Give me more detail about that one. I don't think I've heard of it.
Okay. In all across the Northern Hemisphere, there are little mustelid creatures called martens, M-A-R-T-E-N. And in North America, you've got an animal called the American marten. And in Britain, you've got the pine marten. And all across Europe, there's a pine marten and a beech marten. And there's lots more. There's about 11 of them. But the one in Britain, it was decided that after hundreds of years of them believing that there were two marten species in Britain, a guy called Edward Alston in the 1860s decided that there was only one species in Britain, and ever since people have said there was only one species. But in the last 20 years, pine martens have been turning up in places where they were not supposed to be living anymore, where they're supposed to be hunted to extinction, and there have been reports of things that look very much like beech martens. And I think this is something that's fascinated me for years, and I believe that both species are found in Britain. They're rare, but they're both found in Britain, and they're found far more widely than people actually thought they were.
Well, that sounds really, really interesting. If you had to guess, how many cryptids do you think are in a basis of knowledge around the world at this time?
Hundreds. Which ones? I think the what's it called? The orang pendek and the thylacine are the two most likely to be discovered. But there are lots more, lots and lots more. I wouldn't even like. I would say hundreds, but I wouldn't like to hazard a guess. I've got in my library upstairs. I've got loads and loads and loads of reference books, and I've not actually ever gone through doing doing a list of all of them. But I'm sure they're grounded.
So what do you think will help us to get more evidence of some of the more well-known cryptids, especially, I deal mostly with Bigfoot. My audience mostly has an interest in the Bigfoot phenomena here within the United States. But evidence seems to be very important to them, and they're constantly looking for something that will give us more of a concrete answer to this. What do you think would get us there, and what do you think is going to be the most information that will give us some kind of concrete evidence that a Bigfoot exists or other cryptids?
Okay, two things. DNA and the discovery of this new technology, eDNA, is absolutely absolutely fantastic. It's something that even 10 years ago I'd never heard of. And being able to use eDNA to find out traces of what species have been found in that particular environment, I think is going to be absolutely crucial. And the other thing is tech. I remember, oh God, about 10 years ago, a friend of mine, I'd never even heard of these, a friend of mine bought a drone. And I'd never even heard of this. And it could stay up in the air for about 6 minutes and take very blurry photographs. Nowadays, you can have drones which can travel across half a continent to be used in battle. And you've got drones now that can do broadcast quality video from high up in the sky. And I think with the amazing advances we've got in technology, drones, a mix of the new tech, eDNA, and good old-fashioned natural history legwork, just going out and doing what I call zoological detective work. It's eventually going to reap dividends, and if there are Bigfoots out there, it's going to be things like that that are going to find them.
Very good. So is there anything else you'd like to tell us?
Well, if you're interested in what we do, have a look at the Centre for Fortean Zoology website. We've been going for 32 years now, and we are, I believe, the biggest general cryptozoological organisation in the English-speaking world. And you can just check us out at www.cfz.org.uk, and it'll tell you a lot about what we're doing. It's free to go in, you can explore it. It gives you details of the expeditions we've done, and it's the beginning of an online museum. So I think if you're interested in this stuff, come along in, the water's fine.